Welcome. Today we're going to explore one of the most fascinating political institutions in all of human history, the Roman Senate. This wasn't just any legislative body. This was an organization that would shape the destiny of the Mediterranean world for nearly a millennium. It would outlast kings, consuls, dictators, and emperors. It would survive civil wars, foreign invasions, and complete political transformations. The Roman Senate was, in many ways, the beating heart of Roman civilization itself. But how did it get there? How did this group of aristocratic advisors become the most powerful political force in the ancient world? That's what we're here to find out. Let's start at the very beginning, in the murky depths of Rome's legendary past. According to tradition, Rome was founded in 753 BC by Romulus, the city's first king. Now, we need to be careful here because separating myth from reality in this period is basically impossible. The Romans themselves weren't entirely sure what had happened in these early days. Most of what we know comes from historians writing hundreds of years after the fact, people like Livy and Dionysius of Halicarnassus, who were working with fragments of oral tradition, religious records, and quite a bit of creative imagination. But even if we can't trust all the details, we can still identify some important patterns and structures that probably reflect real historical developments. So, Romulus founds Rome and becomes its first king. But here's the thing, Romulus doesn't rule alone. According to tradition, he immediately recognizes that he needs advisors, people who can help him govern this new city. And where does he find these advisors? From among the heads of Rome's leading families, the paters or fathers. These were the patriarchs of the most important clans in early Rome, men who commanded respect, loyalty, and resources. Romulus supposedly selected 100 of these men to form his council of advisors. This council would eventually become known as the Senatus, which literally means council of elders. The word comes from senex, meaning old men. From the very start, the Senate was conceived as a body of experienced, wise, and presumably old men who would guide the king with their collective wisdom. Now, what did these early senators actually do? Well, their primary function was advisory. The king would consult with them on important matters of state. Should we go to war with our neighbors? Should we accept this treaty? How should we divide up newly conquered land? What laws should we establish? The Senate would discuss these questions, debate among themselves, and then present their recommendations to the king. But here's the crucial point, these were only recommendations. The king had absolutely no obligation to follow the Senate's advice. He could listen politely, nod his head, and then do whatever he wanted. The Senate had no legal authority to compel the king to do anything. They couldn't pass laws on their own. They couldn't veto the king's decisions. They couldn't remove him from office. On paper, at least, the Senate was entirely subordinate to royal authority. But reality, as always, was more complicated than the legal formalities suggest. Because even though the Senate lacked formal power, it possessed something potentially more valuable, influence. These weren't just random citizens the king had plucked off the street. These were the heads of Rome's most powerful families. They controlled vast networks of clients and dependents. They commanded economic resources. They had military experience and connections. If the king wanted to actually govern effectively, he needed these men on his side. A king who consistently ignored his Senate's advice would quickly find himself isolated and vulnerable. So in practice, most kings paid careful attention to what the Senate had to say. They might not always follow the Senate's recommendations, but they couldn't afford to dismiss them entirely either. The Senate's composition evolved over time. Romulus supposedly started with 100 senators, but this number grew as Rome itself grew. When the Sabines were integrated into the Roman community after the famous incident with the Sabine women, new senators were added to represent these families. Later kings added more senators as they expanded Rome's territory and incorporated new populations. By the end of the monarchy, there were probably around 300 senators, though our sources aren't entirely clear on this point. What remained constant was the principle that senators were drawn from Rome's aristocratic families, the patricians who could trace their lineage back to the city's founding fathers. Membership in the Senate was for life, which gave the institution remarkable stability and continuity. While individual kings came and went, the Senate endured. Senators accumulated decades of experience and institutional knowledge. They remembered precedents, understood traditions, and maintained relationships that spanned generations. This gave them a huge advantage when dealing with kings, especially young or inexperienced ones. The Senate could say, well, when King so-and-so faced this situation 30 years ago, here's what he did. This appeal to tradition and precedent was enormously powerful in Roman culture, where respect for ancestral customs, the mos maiorum, was practically a religious obligation. But the Senate's real opportunity to exercise power came during interregnums, the periods between kings. This is where things get really interesting. When a king died, Rome faced a potential crisis. There was no automatic succession, no crown prince waiting in the wings. The Romans never established a hereditary monarchy where the throne automatically passed from father to son. Instead, each new king had to be selected through a complex process, and guess who controlled the process? That's right, the Senate. Here's how it worked. The moment a king died, the auspices, the right to consult the gods and command the army, returned to the Senate as a whole. This was called the interregnum, literally, between reigns. The Senate would immediately convene and select one of their own members to serve as interrex, or between king. This was a fascinating position. The interrex possessed all the powers and authority of a regular king. He could command armies, administer justice, consult the gods, everything. But there was one crucial limitation: he could only serve for 5 days. Just 5 days. After that, his term expired and he had to nominate a successor, another senator who would become the next interrex. This new interrex would also serve for 5 days, then nominate his own successor, and so on. Why such a short term? The Romans were clearly trying to prevent any single senator from using the interregnum to seize permanent power for himself. 5 days wasn't enough time to consolidate a power base or make yourself indispensable. But it was enough time to accomplish the interrex's main task: finding a candidate to become the next permanent king. Each interrex was expected to search for a suitable nominee, someone who possessed the qualities necessary to rule Rome. When he found such a person, he would present this candidate to the Senate for their consideration. Now, think about the incentives this system created. Each interrex knew he had only 5 days to find and present a candidate. If he succeeded, he would go down in history as the man who selected Rome's next king. That's an incredible honor and a tremendous source of prestige. But if he wasted his 5 days and failed to present a candidate, or if the Senate rejected his candidate, then his chance was gone forever. The next interrex would get the opportunity instead. So there was enormous pressure on each interrex to act quickly and decisively. He had every reason to work as fast as possible to get his preferred candidate through the approval process. But the interrex couldn't just pick anyone. His nominee had to be approved by the Senate. The Senate would question the candidate, debate his merits, and ultimately vote on whether to accept him. This gave the Senate as a collective body tremendous power over the selection process. They could reject candidates they didn't like. They could demand concessions or promises from candidates seeking their approval. They could essentially ensure that whoever became king was someone they could work with, someone who understood that he owed his position to the Senate's support. Once the Senate approved a candidate, the process moved to the next stage. The interrex would present the nominee to a public assembly, probably the comitia curiata, the assembly organized by curiae or wards. The people would vote yes or no on the candidate. Notice that this wasn't a competitive election. There was only one candidate on the ballot. The people couldn't choose between multiple options. They could only accept or reject the Senate's pre-approved nominee. In practice, the people almost certainly always voted yes. Why wouldn't they? The Senate had already vetted this person. The interrex had endorsed him. And if the people voted no, what would happen? The whole process would just start over with another pre-approved candidate. The people had no real power to determine who became king, only the power to delay the process by rejecting candidates. After the popular assembly approved the nominee, he would go consult with religious officials, the augurs, who would look for signs from the gods. They would perform divination rituals, watching the flight of birds or examining the entrails of sacrificed animals, searching for divine approval of the new king. This was probably just a formality. We have no record of the augurs ever rejecting a candidate who had already been approved by both the Senate and the people. The gods, it seems, always agreed with the Senate's choice. Funny how that works. Finally, if the augurs gave their blessing, the nominee would return to the popular assembly one last time to request imperium, military command. This was the final step. When the people granted imperium, the process was complete. Rome had a new king, and he could begin his reign. Let's step back and look at what the Senate had accomplished here. They had created a system where they controlled every meaningful stage of the selection process. They chose the interrex. The interrex chose the candidate. The Senate approved the candidate. Only then did the people get to vote, and even then they could only vote yes or no on a single pre-approved option. The religious establishment rubber-stamped the decision. And then the people granted imperium, again with no real alternative. From start to finish, the Senate was pulling the strings. They had constructed an election that wasn't really an election at all, at least not in any sense we would recognize today. It was more like a carefully choreographed ritual designed to give the appearance of popular participation while ensuring that the Senate maintained control over the outcome. This is absolutely crucial for understanding the Senate's power in the monarchical period. Yes, the king had supreme authority during his lifetime. Yes, the Senate's advice was technically non-binding. But the Senate controlled how kings were selected in the first place. Every king knew that he owed his position to the Senate's approval. Every king understood that the Senate had the power to shape who would succeed him. This gave the Senate enormous leverage. A wise king would cultivate good relations with the Senate, would listen to their advice, would defer to their judgment on important matters. Because if he didn't, if he alienated the Senate, what would happen when he died? The Senate would simply ensure that the next king was someone more amenable to their interests. We can see this dynamic playing out in the stories about Rome's 7 kings. According to tradition, Romulus was succeeded by Numa Pompilius, a Sabine known for his piety and wisdom. Numa supposedly established many of Rome's religious institutions and ruled peacefully for decades. After Numa came Tullus Hostilius, a warrior king who conquered Alba Longa. Then Ancus Marcius, who founded Rome's port at Ostia. Then Tarquinius Priscus, an Etruscan who came to Rome as an immigrant and somehow became king. Then Servius Tullius, who may have started as a slave and instituted major constitutional reforms. And finally Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, whose tyrannical behavior would lead to the monarchy's downfall. Now, we can't trust all the details of these stories. But what's interesting is the pattern they reveal. These kings came from different backgrounds. Some were Roman, some were Sabine, some were Etruscan. Some were warriors, some were priests, some were reformers. What they had in common was that each one, in his own way, had to work with the Senate. Even the later Tarquins, who supposedly became tyrannical, initially came to power through the Senate's approval. The stories suggest that when kings respected the Senate and worked within established traditions, things went well. When they tried to rule as autocrats and ignore the Senate's counsel, problems arose. The case of Servius Tullius is particularly instructive. According to tradition, Servius didn't go through the normal selection process. Instead, he seized power in the chaos following the assassination of Tarquinius Priscus. He ruled without the Senate's formal approval, at least initially. But what did Servius do to legitimize his position? He implemented reforms that benefited ordinary Romans, creating a new system of organization based on wealth rather than birth. He built temples, expanded the city, and generally proved himself an effective ruler. Eventually, the Senate and people accepted him as legitimate. The story suggests that even a king who came to power irregularly needed to win the Senate's approval to rule effectively. The final king, Tarquinius Superbus, provides the counterexample. Tarquin supposedly murdered Servius Tullius and seized the throne by force. He then ruled as a tyrant, ignoring the Senate, making decisions unilaterally, and using violence to suppress opposition. He stopped consulting the Senate altogether, treating them with contempt. He executed senators who opposed him and refused to fill vacant seats, deliberately weakening the institution. In other words, Tarquin tried to rule as an absolute monarch without the Senate's cooperation. And how did that work out for him? Not well. According to tradition, in 509 BC, after the rape of Lucretia by Tarquin's son sparked public outrage, the Senate and people of Rome rose up in rebellion. They drove the Tarquins from the city and abolished the monarchy forever. Now, we need to be careful about taking this story at face value. The tale of Lucretia is almost certainly a later invention, a dramatic narrative created to explain and justify the end of the monarchy. The real reasons for the transition from monarchy to republic were probably more complex and prosaic, involving economic changes, social tensions, and political conflicts that our sources don't fully explain. But even if the details are legendary, the basic pattern is probably accurate. The monarchy ended because the last king alienated the Senate and lost their support. When the Senate turned against the monarchy as an institution, the monarchy couldn't survive. And what replaced the monarchy? A system designed and controlled by the Senate. Instead of one king ruling for life, Rome would now have two consuls elected annually. These consuls would share power, each able to veto the other's decisions. They would serve for only 1 year, after which they would return to private life. And who would elect these consuls? Formally, the popular assemblies would vote. But in practice, the Senate would dominate the process, just as they had dominated the selection of kings. The Senate would debate which candidates were suitable. They would use their influence and prestige to support favored candidates. And they would ensure that only men from senatorial families, men who shared the Senate's values and interests, could realistically compete for office. The early republic saw the Senate's power expand dramatically. Without a king to defer to, the Senate became the primary decision-making body in the Roman state. They controlled foreign policy, deciding when to make war and peace. They managed Rome's finances, allocating funds for public works and military campaigns. They assigned provinces to magistrates and determined how many troops each commander would receive. They received foreign ambassadors and negotiated treaties. They issued emergency decrees in times of crisis. Formally, the Senate still only had advisory power. Their decisions were called senatus consulta, consultations of the Senate, not laws. But in practice, their advice was almost always followed. To ignore the Senate's recommendations was politically unthinkable for most magistrates. The Senate also maintained control over membership in their own body. During the monarchy, the king could appoint new senators. In the early republic, this power passed to the consuls, but they exercised it sparingly and always chose men from established patrician families. Later, the responsibility for enrolling senators shifted to the censors, magistrates elected every 5 years to conduct the census and review the Senate's membership. The censors could add new members to the Senate and remove existing members for moral failings or misconduct. But the censors themselves were always senior senators, men who had previously served as consuls. So the Senate essentially controlled its own membership, maintaining its aristocratic character and excluding outsiders. This exclusivity was both the Senate's greatest strength and a source of ongoing tension. The Senate represented only a tiny fraction of Rome's population, the patrician elite who traced their ancestry back to the city's founding. The vast majority of Romans, the plebeians, had no representation in the Senate and no voice in its deliberations. This created a fundamental divide in Roman society, a class conflict between patricians and plebeians that would dominate Roman politics for centuries. The plebeians would eventually force the patricians to grant them their own representatives, the tribunes of the plebs, and their own assembly, the concilium plebis. They would win the right to hold high office and join the Senate. They would secure legal protections and economic reforms. But all of this would take time, generations of struggle and conflict. Through it all, the Senate endured. It adapted to new circumstances, absorbed new members, and maintained its position at the center of Roman political life. The Senate that had advised kings became the Senate that guided consuls. The institution that had controlled the selection of monarchs became the institution that shaped republican politics. The Council of Elders that had started with 100 men grew into a body of 300, then 600 senators who collectively governed an expanding empire. This transformation didn't happen overnight. It took decades for the republican system to stabilize, for new traditions and procedures to develop, for the Senate to fully establish its authority in the post-monarchical world. There were setbacks and challenges along the way. But the foundation had been laid during the monarchy. The Senate's power in the Republic wasn't something entirely new. It was the culmination of a process that had been underway for centuries, ever since Romulus first gathered those 100 family heads to advise him. The Senate had always been powerful, even when kings nominally ruled Rome. The transition to the Republic simply made that power explicit and formal. So when we talk about the rise of the Roman Senate, we're really talking about a gradual process of institutional development that spanned Rome's entire monarchical period. The Senate rose by making itself indispensable to the functioning of the Roman state. It rose by controlling the selection of kings and ensuring that every king owed his position to senatorial approval. It rose by accumulating experience, knowledge, and institutional memory that no individual magistrate could match. It rose by representing Rome's most powerful families and serving as the vehicle through which aristocratic power was exercised collectively. And it rose by showing remarkable adaptability, surviving the transition from monarchy to republic and positioning itself to thrive in the new political order. The Roman Senate would go on to guide Rome through 500 years of republican government. It would oversee Rome's transformation from a small city-state into the dominant power of the Mediterranean world. It would survive civil wars, social upheavals, and constitutional crises. Even after the Republic fell and emperors rose to power, the Senate would persist, adapting once again to new circumstances. The institution that had begun as a council of 100 advisors to Rome's first king would endure for over 1,000 years, outlasting every other institution of the ancient world. That's the story of the rise of the Roman Senate, not a sudden revolution, but a long, gradual accumulation of power and influence that began in Rome's earliest days and reached its zenith in the Republican period. It's a testament to the importance of institutions in political life, and a reminder that formal authority and real power don't always align. The Senate never had the legal right to command, but it possessed something more valuable: the ability to shape outcomes through influence, tradition, and control over key political processes. That's how the Senate rose, and that's why it mattered so much to Roman history. Like and subscribe for more. Thanks for watching.